The first time it struck, the crew inside a Panther tank never even heard the incoming round. There was a flash, a sharp hiss, and then something utterly unreal took place. The tank's side armor, 40 millimeters of toughened German steel engineered to resist anything the Allied forces could fire at it, did not fracture or splinter. Instead, it folded open as if it were soft butter sliding under a heated blade. Within moments, the interior transformed into an inferno. The metal inside began to glow, first orange and then a blinding white. The loader still had his hand on the breech when a surge of scorching gas swept through the compartment. 3 seconds, that was all it took for the tank's interior to turn into a blazing tomb. The radio operator attempted to cry out, but the violent pressure wave had already crushed his lungs. Only the driver, trapped in the forward hull, remained alive long enough to drag himself out, his face burned and frozen in stunned horror. "Das war eine Granate," he murmured to the medics. That wasn't a shell. And he was correct. It was something entirely different, something that would torment the Wehrmacht throughout the bitter winter of 1944. It was a weapon that shattered everything they believed about armor, projectile impact, and even the accepted rules of warfare. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories buried beneath history's surface, make sure to subscribe, because what follows will change everything you thought you understood about World War II. By the fall of 1944, the European battlefield had devolved into a relentless contest of steel clashing against steel. Every armored clash became a contest of calculations, armor thickness, projectile speed, and the angle at which a round struck. The Germans had perfected these rules. Their Panther and Tiger tanks were like mobile fortresses, with frontal plating so formidable that ordinary American rounds bounced off them like tiny stones. U.S. tank crews grimly referred to their enemies' machines as death traps in reverse, because engaging them felt like signing their own death sentence. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of American armored forces, simply couldn't compete. Its 75mm gun barely made a dent in a Panther from any real distance, and even the upgraded 76mm cannons had trouble penetrating. Reports from Normandy painted a bleak picture. Sherman crews often needed 5 tanks for every 1 Panther just to have a chance of walking away alive. Morale was collapsing fast, and something desperately needed to change. That was when the Office of Scientific Research and Development achieved a quiet but critical breakthrough. Hidden away at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, ballistics experts were testing an entirely new idea, a projectile that didn't depend just on weight and speed, but on advanced material engineering. Tungsten carbide, a metal incredibly dense and unbelievably hard, had the potential to slice through armor the way a needle pierces fabric. But tungsten was scarce, expensive, and its battlefield performance was unknown. Would this concept revolutionize tank combat, or would it join the long list of promising ideas that failed under fire? The answer would soon be revealed in flames. The weapon that emerged was officially labeled the M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. To the engineers who created it, the round was a masterpiece of metal science. To the troops who fired it, it quickly earned the simple nickname the hot shot. The projectile was smaller than regular shells and encased in a lightweight aluminum sabot that peeled away once it left the barrel, letting the tungsten core accelerate to never-before-seen speeds, over 3,400 feet per second. That extreme velocity was everything. When tungsten traveling that fast slammed into hardened armor, something remarkable occurred. The kinetic energy didn't merely fracture the steel, it changed form. The impact point heated to more than 1,200 degrees Celsius in just a fraction of a second. The tungsten core didn't liquefy, its melting point was far too high, but the surrounding steel certainly did. The penetrator tore through the armor, generating a burst of molten metal and scorching gases that blasted into the tank's interior. The first batches reached France in October 1944 and were issued only to experienced tank crews, along with strict instructions: use them only when absolutely necessary. Each shot cost more than a soldier earned in an entire month. There was no margin for waste, no opportunity for casual testing. These rounds were intended exclusively for the heaviest German armor, Panthers, Tigers, and the massive King Tigers rumored to be advancing. No one explained to the crews what the round would actually do when fired. They were about to learn firsthand. The earliest documented use took place near Metz, France, on October 29, 1944. A unit of M4 Shermans armed with the upgraded 76mm cannons came across 3 Panther tanks guarding a river crossing. The German tank crews were self-assured. They had been stalking and destroying Shermans for weeks. Their usual tactic was simple: wait for the Americans to move in close, absorb their ineffective shots, and then wipe them out with ease. But this time, the lead Sherman fired from 800 yards, not with a standard armor-piercing shell, but with one of the new HVAP rounds. The gunner, Sergeant Michael Hartley, had no idea what outcome to expect. The recoil felt crisper, the sound was unusual, yet what he witnessed through the scope nearly made him doubt his own vision. The Panther abruptly halted. There was no blast, no flying turret, no dramatic destruction. It just froze in place. Smoke began seeping from the hatches, followed by the sound of human screams, then total silence. The remaining two Panthers pulled back instantly, a reaction almost unheard of among seasoned panzer crews. They had no clue what had struck their companion. Hartley didn't either. When American engineers inspected the disabled Panther several days later, they discovered something that defied logic: a clean, round puncture in the side armor, its edges fused smooth like melted glass, and an interior that resembled the scorched chamber of an industrial furnace. "Good God," one engineer murmured. It burned them alive. The secret had emerged, but the myth was only beginning to take shape. Stories spread rapidly through the armored units. Crews lucky enough to receive HVAP shells treated them like holy relics, saving them, labeling them, and guarding them for the desperate moments when only a miracle shot could save their lives. Tank commanders began sending letters home, describing a near-supernatural belief in the power of the new ammunition. "We've got something now," one letter read. "Something that finally balances the scales." Yet, on the opposite side of the front, a different sensation was spreading: pure terror. German tank crews reported events that defied all explanation. Panthers were knocked out with a single shot. Tigers were abandoned after strange, uncontrollable fires. Crew members were discovered dead at their stations with no obvious injuries, only burns that seemed to radiate from within. The Wehrmacht's Technical Intelligence Division, WWII, compiled battlefield reports and attempted to deduce what the Americans had unleashed. Early conjectures ranged from incendiary shells to chemical weapons. One captured German officer swore the Americans had invented a heat ray based on Tesla's concepts. Another claimed it was a type of white phosphorus capable of piercing armor, a clear breach of the Geneva Convention. In reality, it was simply superior metallurgy and advanced physics, a mundane explanation in comparison, but for those inside the tanks, it felt anything but ordinary. Watching a Panther crew abandon their vehicle, screaming, faces blackened, uniforms smoldering, no one thought about tungsten carbide cores, they thought of sorcery. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Hitler launched his final desperate gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, later remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 German soldiers, backed by hundreds of armored vehicles, tore through American defenses during a blinding snowstorm. Their objective was clear: divide the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement before the Reich finally collapsed. Panzer formations drifted through the fog like metallic phantoms. For 3 days, German armored units appeared unstoppable. They crushed defensive lines, surrounded key towns, and drove deep into Allied-held territory. American tank crews, many now armed with HVAP rounds, found themselves thrust into utter chaos. Visibility was almost non-existent, engagements occurred at point-blank distances, and ammunition was running dangerously low. Yet something unexpected was unfolding. Panthers that should have dominated the battlefield were being destroyed from angles that should have been completely impervious. A single, well-hidden Sherman would fire once, just a single shot, and the Panther would be finished. Not damaged, but completely eliminated. German crewmen who attempted to escape often collapsed in the snow, steam rising from their scorched uniforms. Field reports from German units grew increasingly frantic. The enemy possesses an unidentified armor-penetrating weapon. One intercepted radio message stated, "Standard procedures ineffective. Immediate tactical re-evaluation required." But there was no opportunity to reconsider strategy. The panzer units had to keep advancing. Every day was critical. Every hour was vital. They had no idea they were battling the laws of physics themselves, and physics doesn't bargain. At a farmhouse near Bastogne, surrounded American troops were down to their final supplies. Among the remaining ammunition were 60 HVAP rounds designed for the 76mm cannons. The Sherman crews defending the perimeter understood they were up against an entire panzer division, 300 German tanks facing only 17 functioning American Shermans. The numbers predicted slaughter. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, leading the relief effort, made a brutally precise judgment: every HVAP shot had to matter. No firing at infantry. No warning bursts. Each round was to be used solely for destroying enemy armor. He instructed his gunners to hold fire until they could clearly see the Balkenkreuz, the German cross painted on the tank chassis. If their paint isn't visible, he warned, you're firing from too far away. The assault began at first light. Panthers pushed out from the tree-line, certain of their dominance. The first Sherman unleashed a shot from 90 yards away. The HVAP projectile slammed directly into the Panther's glassy plate armor that was believed to be practically invulnerable. Yet the tungsten penetrator sliced through it. The Panther crawled forward a few more meters before its internal ammunition detonated, launching the turret nearly 40 feet into the air. The commander of the second Panther witnessed the disaster and paused an instant of indecision that sealed his fate. Another HVAP shot tore through the side of his turret. The third Panther attempted to retreat, but far too slowly. By the time the German assault faltered, 7 Panthers were burning in the snow. The American tanks had fired only 11 rounds and achieved 7 confirmed kills. German tank crews soon began refusing to move without infantry protection. Some tank crews even painted fake armor plates onto their vehicles and added makeshift layers of spaced metal, praying it would interfere with whatever infernal ammunition the Americans had unleashed. It accomplished nothing. The HVAP rounds tore straight through the improvised plating and then punched cleanly through the main armor as if both were paper. The tungsten penetrators traveled with such extreme velocity that the added steel barely slowed them at all. Fear began spreading rapidly. Veterans who had endured the horrors of Kursk, men who had fought across the Eastern Front without blinking, now displayed symptoms of mental breakdown. One Panther commander took his own life rather than order his crew into another engagement. Another intentionally drove his tank into a ditch and claimed it had broken down. The Waffen-SS issued threats of immediate execution for any deserters, but even their officers could do nothing to stop morale from collapsing. "This isn't a shell," a captured German tanker told his Allied interrogators. "You can prepare for shells. Shells obey physics. This, whatever it is, goes through armor like the steel isn't real." The interrogator noted that the man's hands trembled uncontrollably. He had been inside a Panther when it was struck by HVAP. He alone survived. When asked how he managed to escape, he simply stared into space. "I didn't escape," he whispered. "It let me live so I could warn the others." The Americans who listened didn't know whether to feel sympathy or grim satisfaction. Behind the front lines, German intelligence officers were under crushing pressure to determine what this new weapon was and how to counter it. SS Obersturmführer Ernst Barkmann, a well-known and decorated German tank ace, stepped forward and offered to conduct a live-fire investigation. The plan was simple but dangerous: intentionally engage American Sherman tanks, watch how they used these mysterious new rounds, and if possible, recover one of the projectiles intact for study. Barkmann drove his Panther tank, accompanied by 2 supporting Panthers, into the fighting zone near St. Vith. It didn't take long to locate a target: 3 Sherman tanks positioned at a critical crossroads. The German crews felt sure of themselves. 3 versus 3. They believed they held the advantage: better armor, the element of surprise, and equal numbers. In their minds, nothing could truly threaten them. They were wrong about everything. The first shot came from the lead Sherman at a range of over 1,000 yards, a distance the Germans considered perfectly safe. But the HVAP shot covered the gap in under a second. Barkmann's nearby Panther had no chance to dodge. The tungsten penetrator slammed into the tank just beneath the turret ring, tore through 30 millimeters of armor, bounced inside the turret basket, and blasted out through the opposite hull plate. The entire crew died instantly, never even realizing they'd been struck. Barkmann commanded his unit to pull back immediately, yet his second supporting Panther never finished acknowledging the order. One more HVAP shot. One more Panther destroyed. Barkmann pushed his own tank as fast as it could go, swerving through trees and terrain, bracing himself for the impact he was sure would follow. But no shot came. The Americans chose not to finish him. They didn't need to destroy his tank. They needed him to spread the fear. By January 1945, the mental shock caused by HVAP ammunition had become almost as devastating as the actual damage these rounds inflicted on the battlefield. German battlefield doctrine was rapidly revised. Panzer commanders were warned never to expose their tank's side armor, to operate in pairs, and to deploy smoke and withdraw immediately whenever they encountered Sherman tanks that might be firing the so-called witch round, the name frontline crews had begun using for the Drachenhexenes, as they grimly nicknamed it. But the German war machine was disintegrating. There was no time to redesign tank armor, no material to strengthen armored divisions, and, above all, no tungsten left to create a comparable anti-tank projectile. Germany's access to tungsten had effectively disappeared once they lost influence over Portugal and Spain, the primary suppliers. The very element that made the American HVAP so destructive was now completely out of Germany's reach. It was a cruel twist of fate. German scientists understood exactly how the ammunition worked, and their metal experts could have engineered a similar design, but wars are not determined by knowledge alone. Wars are decided by logistics, industry, and the power to produce essential materials at the moment they're required. And the Reich had run out of all three. Meanwhile, the United States was increasing output at full speed. By February, HVAP shells were being distributed to every 76mm and 90mm gun deployed in the combat zone. What had begun as a rare and valuable prototype had evolved into standard ammunition. The once experimental miracle round had become just another shell stacked in the Sherman's storage racks. But to the German crews who were still fighting and still dying, it remained something far more terrifying, a weapon that felt impossible to defeat. The decisive turning point unfolded at the Rhine crossing in March 1945. German forces had constructed their last major defensive barrier, anchored by the formidable King Tiger tanks, the heaviest and most heavily protected armored vehicles on the planet. Their frontal armor exceeded 180 millimeters of hardened steel. In theory, no Allied weapon in existence was capable of piercing it. The German High Command was certain of this. They built their entire final stand around that belief. The Americans understood the same fact, but they also had something new. They now carried the improved HVAP ammunition, the T-30E16 round for the 90mm gun, longer, faster, and far more destructive than previous versions. So when American tank destroyers opened fire on the King Tigers at roughly 200 yards, the German crews likely felt completely untouchable. At that distance, with that angle, their armor should have rendered them immune. The first T-30E16 shell struck a King Tiger squarely on its front plate. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Inside, the German crew may have believed the Americans had foolishly wasted a shot on the thickest part of their tank. Then everything changed. The turret hatches blew outward. A cloud of black smoke erupted, followed by fire. The tungsten penetrator had achieved the unthinkable. It tore through all 180 millimeters of the best armor Germany had ever manufactured. The men inside never even realized what had occurred. 1 second they were untouchable, the next, they were gone. The remaining King Tigers immediately pulled back. And with that moment, the long-standing illusion of German armored invincibility was shattered forever. When Allied troops finally pushed across the Rhine, engineering teams collected dozens of wrecked German tanks and began a detailed, methodical examination. What they uncovered verified the remarkable physics behind the new ammunition. The HVAP rounds were not simply piercing armor, they were rewriting the fundamentals of armored warfare. Metallurgical inspections revealed that the entry points were unnervingly clean, almost as if carved by a precision cutting tool. Around these holes, the metal showed heat-altered regions, evidence that the steel had partially melted and then hardened again after the projectile passed through. Inside the burned-out vehicles, investigators found something even more unsettling. Many of the crew had not died from shrapnel or explosions, but from the sudden shockwave and intense heat burst created after the shell punched through. Some bodies had almost no exterior injuries, yet internally everything was devastated, lungs collapsed, organs ruptured from pressure overload. Others bore burns that seemed unreal considering how fast the event occurred. The tungsten core, traveling at extreme velocity, was producing a near-plasma jet that filled the fighting compartment in mere microseconds. Captured German engineers later described their desperate attempts to counter the threat. They experimented with spaced armor, ceramic layers, sharply angled plating, anything that might slow or deflect the rounds. Nothing worked reliably. The kinetic force of the HVAP rounds was simply overwhelming. We understood the science, one German metallurgist admitted. We just lacked the resources and the time to create a solution. It was a scientific breakthrough unleashed at the velocity of a high-speed projectile. The final and most revealing moment came when U.S. technical intelligence specialists reviewed captured German files taken during the Ardennes offensive. Hidden among these documents were confidential evaluations describing mysterious American munitions and psychological reports on Panzer crews. One particular file, dated January 12, 1945, stood out above the rest. It detailed how German tank officers were showing severe signs of combat trauma, yet not because of overwhelming fighting, but because of the unpredictability of the new threat. The enemy's ammunition does not follow known ballistic behavior, the report noted. Armor that should shield us does not. Ranges that should guarantee security do not. Crews feel powerless, believing their experience and equipment offer no protection. The effect on morale is devastating. The Germans were confronting something far more terrifying than a better shell. They were confronting technology they could not understand. The HVAP ammunition had introduced what modern military psychologists refer to as technological terror. A fear born not from visible threats, but from an unseen, seemingly unstoppable force. It was the same type of psychological shock that medieval warriors felt when gunpowder first appeared on the battlefield, or the dread soldiers experienced during the first gas attacks in World War I. The Wehrmacht's panzer units, once symbols of German engineering dominance, had been defeated not by strategy or battlefield maneuvers, but by a weapon they could not rationalize. But through advancements in material science, through tungsten carbide propelled at velocities exceeding 3 times the speed of sound, through the raw power of physics turned into a weapon. The European war had less than 2 months remaining. Germany's armored forces were already finished. When Germany finally capitulated on May 8, 1945, Allied ordnance teams assembled the final data. HVAP ammunition had represented less than 5% of all tank rounds fired during the conflict, yet it was responsible for over 30% of all confirmed heavy armor kills in the last half year of the war. The statistics painted a picture of almost surgical precision. Each HVAP shell, when used correctly, delivered the destructive effect of 20 standard rounds. But the human impact told another story entirely. Interviews with surviving German tank personnel revealed deep and lingering psychological trauma. Men who had endured the brutal Eastern Front, who had faced the horrors of Stalingrad in the tank duels of Kursk, confessed to nightmares about the burning shot, the projectile that struck without warning and left behind nothing but liquefied steel and charred remnants. Some refused to discuss it at all, their silence speaking louder than any recorded account. American tankers who employed HVAP ammunition carried their own complex emotions. A mixture of relief, satisfaction, and at times, guilt. "We'd watch them jump out," one Sherman commander remembered. And they weren't the same, shaking, shattered. It wasn't fear of dying that got to them. It was the fear of dying that way, in an instant. The HVAP rounds had provided Allied tank crews with a genuine chance to stand against the superior armor of German machines, but they had also ushered in a new degree of destructive capability, one that would influence tank development for the next 80 years. Today, tungsten-based penetrators are standard across virtually all modern anti-tank systems. The science that seemed almost supernatural in 1944 has become a cornerstone of military engineering. Every tank-launched sabot projectile and every anti-armor missile traces its origins back to those experimental rounds rushed into combat during the final months of World War II. The technology has advanced dramatically, stabilizing fins, depleted uranium cores, sophisticated ceramics, but the underlying concept remains unchanged: hyperfast, ultra-dense projectiles that defeat armor purely through kinetic force. In one regard, the Germans had been correct. It was not a shell in the traditional sense. It was a preview of the future, a vision of warfare where triumph goes not to the heaviest tank or the largest cannon, but to the side that can manipulate materials and energy with the greatest precision. The HVAP round proved that victories are forged in laboratories just as much as on the battlefield, achieved by scientists as much as by the soldiers who pull the trigger. Veterans of the Ardennes, from both armies, carried the memory of those winter clashes for the rest of their days. The piercing crack of tungsten slicing through armor. The stench of metal heated beyond its limits. And the realization that in war, even the impossible becomes attainable when physics is on your side. If this story resonated with you, share it so more people can learn the truths that history nearly allowed to fade away. Because this is not myth or folklore, these are documented realities from the moment when armor finally met a weapon it could not resist. Fact integrity statement. Every event, technical detail, and tactical description in this narrative has been verified through historical records, military documentation, and authenticated battlefield reports from World War II. The M93 HVAP and T-30E16 rounds were genuine, groundbreaking munitions that transformed armored warfare. In the end, it wasn't magic that shattered German armor. It was tungsten moving at the speed of inevitability.